Hi everyone, today is Monday, May 11th, 2020, and today in social studies we'll be talking about primary and secondary sources to tell about history. So you might be asking, primary and secondary sources, what are those? Well, last week, remember we were talking about using the words past, present, and future. Well, this week, and we also used the word history, well, this week we are going to talk about the past, things that have happened before today in the past, and particularly we're talking about history. And remember, history, when we define that, history tells the story of people and places from the past. History also tells about events that happened long ago. So we are going to talk about how there are primary and secondary sources that we're going to read about, so we'll understand what that means. We use those and we know about how those tell us about history. They tell us about events, about things that happened a long time ago, okay? Things that happened in the past. So let's get started. How we learn about history. There are many ways to learn about history. You can interview people or ask them questions. You can have a conversation or talk about the past. Have you ever sat there and talked to mom or dad or grandma and grandpa and said, Mom, Dad, can you tell me about when I was a baby? That is how you can have an interview or just a conversation and talk about the past. When you were a baby has already happened, right? So there's many times that you might say, yeah, tell me about when I was a baby. What did I do? Or you might have questions. So that's one way that we can learn about history, about things in the past. You can learn from a document or a paper with words on it. Photographs show how people and places looked. Have you ever gone back and looked at a picture of what you looked like when you were born and when you were a little baby? That's history, guys. That's our things that happened in the past, okay? Some of you are 7 now, and you can go back and look at a picture when you were born and when you were a newborn baby, where you can even look at pictures when you turned 1. All those photographs that you're looking at tells a story. It tells a story about you from the past, back when you were younger and when you were a baby. We also have songs that tell how people felt. Artifacts or objects that are made by people can also show things used in the past. So up here I said I will know how we, and look at that. There is a typo here. How we use primary and secondary sources to tell about the future. Okay, so primary sources. We're going to learn about what that means. Right here in this heading, we know this section is going to tell us about primary sources. So let's learn about what that is. Okay, primary sources. We can categorize or group ways to learn about the past. Documents, so they're like papers, and photographs, another word for pictures, are primary sources. A primary source is written or made by a person who was at an event. So if there's a picture and you're looking at the picture, if your mom or dad or someone in your family took that picture, they were at that event. Say it's a picture of your first year when you turned 1 birthday party. Mom and dad or someone took a picture. They were there. They were at that party and they took a picture. So it's a primary source. You just can remember it's something that a person made who was at the event. So if we're talking about a picture, maybe mom or dad took a picture and they were there. Okay. Another example of a primary source is a map. It can show what a place looked like in the past. So if someone, a person who makes maps, drew out a map, they drew a map of maybe what the city looks like. They were there. They drew that map. They were there and they looked at the city and they drew out a map of what the city looks like. That's another example of a primary source. A letter. If you write a letter, how many of us write letters to Santa or might write a letter to someone? That doesn't happen as often, but if you write a letter, you wrote that. You wrote that yourself. So that could be another example of a primary source. Okay? So now that we've talked about primary sources, remember, a primary source, what you really have to just remember about a primary source is that it is, and I'm going to go highlight it so that we can remember this part. I'll highlight it in yellow. A primary source, it is right here. It was written or made by a person who was at the event. So the main thing that you really want to think about is who was there. If you were there, who was at the event, right there, okay? So that's the key thing about a primary source. It's written or made by a person who was at the event. So if I'm at a birthday party and I take a picture, that picture is a primary source. If I draw a map and I was at a place, I was looking at the place to draw a map, then I was there. So that is an example of a primary source. If I wrote a letter and I send it to you, I wrote that letter. So that's another example of a primary source. Now let's talk about a secondary source right here, secondary sources. A secondary source also tells about people, places, and events from the past. These sources were written or made after the event happened, later, okay? So like your school books, like our books, our Orgo books, or our reading books that would open up and read stories or we would complete activities, that was written in the past, okay? It wasn't done right then. So your books, your school books, books in the library that you would check out, those books were written in the past. They weren't written right that day. They were written in the past by different authors. That's another example of secondary sources. So just so that we can get a better idea of primary and secondary sources, let's do a sort, okay? This is going to help us better understand primary and secondary sources because it can be confusing. So I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of primary and secondary sources. So we're going to do a few together, and then you'll finish this off on your own. What you'll do is you'll open up your journal page, you'll draw a line halfway down, then you'll write at the top, you'll write primary sources, and the second half you'll write secondary sources. You're not going to draw the pictures. Do you notice how I labeled each picture? You're just going to write those words. You're going to sort the items into primary and secondary sources. And when we do that, we want to think about, did this happen? Was this written right then, or was it written after the fact? Okay, so was it written later, after the events happened? Okay, so let's see. We've already talked about photographs, and we said that those, if I was there and I took the picture, that could be considered a primary source because I was there, I took the picture. So then I could take photographs and I could just simply write. I'm going to open this up so I can get my writing there. So I would write right here, I'm going to write photographs because that would be considered a primary source. And it's okay if we get these confused because we're just learning about them, right? So we're just going to do our best to see. The question you want to ask when you're trying to decide, does it belong under primary or secondary? Did it happen? Was I there at the event? Or was it, if it was? Remember, let's go back here. A primary source is written or made by a person who was at an event. A secondary source was written, and we'll just kind of circle or highlight this part right here. A secondary source was written or made after the event happened, okay? So when you're trying to sort these and not sure, just come back and read these parts. Was it written or made by a person who was at the event? Or were the sources written or made after the event? Okay, so that's what we want to keep in mind. So we're going to go back over here. let's come back over here, and I might even just over here, just so that we can remember, I'm going to just right here type primary. The person may, what did it say here? The person was at an event, okay? So we might say the person who wrote or made the source, who made or wrote the source was at the event, okay? But a secondary, just so that we can have it on this page, a secondary would be the source was written after the event happened. So we'll go back over here. Oops. The source was made or written after the, and I'm going to highlight that, or just capitalize it, after the, oops, I'm going to move this, event happened. And I'm going to fix that there. I'm going to move this down. I thought maybe I should probably, this right here. I'm going to move this down here, and I'm going to move this back down here. So right here, so that we can better understand this. For primary, the person who made or wrote the source was at the event. So right here is where I really want to emphasize, right here. Maybe I just do this, at the event. Make it in all capital letters, at the event, so it sticks out, okay? I just thought about that. I thought maybe let's make sure that we can, this can be confusing. So when you're sorting it from primary, secondary, ask, was the person who made the source, could they have been at the event? If they could have, then you would mark it under primary. When you're looking at sources for secondary, was the source made after or written after the event happened? That's another way. So let's see if we can find something for secondary. Now that we've kind of, have hopefully cleared that up. Okay, so if I am looking at some of these other things, I've already done photographs. Let's talk about history books. The person who made or wrote a history book, were they there when it happened? No, right? History, remember, history's events that have happened way long ago. So that would be a secondary source, right? So then we will come here and you would just write the words. And let me make sure I have my pencil on. So then I'm going to come here and I'm going to write history book. This history books is going to fall under secondary sources. So we've done photographs and history books. What else could be a primary source? Where the person who made or wrote the source was at the event. What about, we talked about a map. Remember, you write a map, you could have been there and you wrote the map, not in the past, but maybe if you did a map of a city or a map of a building. Many times, if you go to the mall, there might be a map of the building, of where the stores are at the mall. You go look at that map if you're looking for a store. That person was there, right? So we could say that another example of a primary source would be a map, right? So, guys, finish up the sort. Don't forget to take a picture of your work and upload it to the assignment in Google Classroom. If you have any questions on the assignment, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.